This video is an adaptation of a thread called Ergativity for Novices on the ZBB written by Bradron, who kindly permitted me to reproduce it in this form. I have edited and trimmed it, but it remains mostly the same. Let us begin. For my most recent conlang, I decided to use an ergative morphosyntactic alignment. Naturally, I began to research how ergativity works, only to find that there are very few overviews of ergativity available online, and those that do exist aren't terribly detailed. Furthermore, since I started reading published books and articles about ergativity a week or two ago, I've realized that there are many important details which are not covered in existing tutorials. Due to this, I've decided to write my own overview of ergativity, which aims to be much more detailed than existing tutorials, while being short enough to avoid qualifying as book length. I would welcome any questions, comments, suggestions, corrections, or additions from anyone watching this if they have any. In terms of contents, this will be split into 5 sections. Section 0, this introduction, asks, what is ergativity? Section 1 looks at morphological ergativity. Section 2 looks at split ergativity and is itself divided into 3 subparts. Section 3 looks at syntactic ergativity, as distinct from morphological ergativity, and Section 4 looks at the diachronics of ergativity, that is to say how ergativity arises or changes throughout the passage of time. My 2 main sources were R.W.M. Dixon's book, Ergativity, and William B. McGregor's article, Typology of Ergativity. The first is an excellent resource covering just about every aspect of ergativity, and my main source for this video. I highly recommend reading this book for anyone who's interested in ergativity beyond what I can cover here. I will refer to this book a lot, and refer to it simply as Dixon. McGregor's article I see more of a quick overview of the subject than as a tutorial suitable for learning from. Still, it contains descriptions of some phenomena which Dixon does not mention. Similarly to the Dixon book, I will refer to this article as McGregor. So, what is ergativity? Universal grammatical relations. Let's start with the basics. Recall that all languages contain 2 main types of clauses. Intransitive clauses, which contain a verb plus 1 core argument, such as I laugh, and verbs which can occur in these clauses are called intransitive verbs, and transitive clauses, which contain a verb plus 2 core arguments, such as I see you. Verbs which can occur in these clauses are also called transitive verbs. Some languages also have ambitransitive or labile verbs which can be used both transitively and intransitively. I'll refer to these later. Based on this, we can classify noun phrases in a sentence as being in one of 3 quote-unquote primitive grammatical relations. The sole argument of an intransitive verb, denoted with S, the subject of a transitive verb, denoted by A, and the object of a transitive verb, denoted by O. Note that conventions differ for these abbreviations. The ones here are Dixon's and seem to be more or less standard. For instance, in the previously mentioned sentence, we can see that in I laugh, we can identify I with the S argument, and in I see you, we can identify I with the A argument and you with the O argument. These relations are almost always marked in some way, either through case marking on the noun phrases, agreement markers on the verb, word order, or a combination of these. For instance, in English, A is the first argument, whereas O is the second argument. In a language like Latin, they would be determined by the fact that A is in the nominative case, while O is in the accusative case. A, O, and control. For a transitive verb with 2 arguments, one argument is mapped onto A, while the other is mapped to O. An important question about these is this: how, for a particular verb, can one determine which argument is A and which argument is O? The answer has to do with the idea of control over an action. In the majority of languages, those with what Dixon calls syntactic-based marking, if you take a verb, the arguments which get mapped onto the A and O roles can be determined by looking at a prototypical usage of that verb. Generally, in the prototypical usage, one argument will have control over the action, while another argument will be most affected by that action. the former argument is called the agent and is assigned the A role, while the latter argument is the patient and is assigned the O role. For instance, with the word hit, a prototypical usage would be something like, he hit me. In this prototypical sentence, the hitter, he, is in control of the action, while the hittee, me, is most affected by the action. Thus, on the basis of this prototypical usage, the hitter is mapped onto the A role, while the hittee is mapped to the O role. English uses mostly word order to mark A and O, and so this is why the hitter comes before the verb, while the hittee comes after it. Note that the use of the prototypical meaning is used to determine A and O, even in a sentence like, the falling branch hit me, where the branch is not really in control of the action. The branch is still mapped to A and me mapped to O, based on the mappings determined from the prototypical sentence. The important takeaway here is this. The A relation represents the argument which prototypically controls the event, while the O relation represents the argument which prototypically does not control the event. This is in fact an important statement about A and O, and will become very important later when we look at split ergativity. As an aside, the above procedure of using a prototypical sentence to find the agent and patient may seem a bit restrictive. In particular, many non-prototypical sentences do not have A as the agent and O as the patient. And what about verbs where there is no obvious agent or patient? This second problem in particular can be seen in English. I like the painting has I as the A argument and the painting as the O argument, but the painting pleases me does the opposite. There are several languages which solve this problem by using semantically based marking. In these languages, nouns are marked for their semantic role in each individual sentence, rather than their semantic role in the prototypical sentence. For instance, the Tibeto-Burman language Manipuri has 3 nominal suffixes: n, marking the controller of an action, bu, marking an animate affected by an action, and de or wonde, marking something indirectly involved in an action. These nominal suffixes apply at the level of individual sentences. Dixon gives the example I, n, touched, tomba, bu, with the implication that I am in control, namely that I did it intentionally, versus I, 0 marked, touched, tomba, bu, with the implication that I am not in control, i.e. I did it unintentionally. This sort of duality in meaning will become very familiar later on when we look at fluid S systems. Languages with semantically based marking are fascinating, but this topic is tangential to ergativity, so I will refrain from further discussion. For more information, refer to Dixon's book. Morphosyntactic alignment, tripartite, nominative-accusative, and ergative-absolutive languages. We have established that the core arguments of verbs can be analysed in terms of 3 primitive grammatical relations, these being the sole intransitive argument S, the transitive agent A, and the transitive patient O. I now want to focus on the way in which these relations are marked, and how they are marked is called the morphosyntactic alignment of a language. The ostensibly simplest morphosyntactic alignment is a tripartite alignment, where S, A, and O are all marked differently. This is the approach taken by the Nez Perce language, where it has 3 noun cases: a null morpheme for S, nim for A, and ne for O. However, this approach is quite redundant. If we see a core argument of an intransitive sentence, we automatically know that it must be in the S role. So, if we merge the marking of S with A or S with O, we can get by with only 2 different types of marking without any ambiguity. This is the approach taken by the vast majority of the world's languages. If S is merged with A, the resulting alignment is called nominative-accusative. This alignment has 2 different ways of marking arguments. One is used for S and A, and the other is used for O. If a language has noun cases, the S-A case is called the nominative case, while the O case is called the accusative case. If it isn't obvious, English is an example of a nominative-accusative language, as shown by its word order, since S and A both go before the verb, while O goes after. Insofar as English has noun cases, they are also nominative-accusative. The nominative Nominative pronouns, I, we, he, she, and they, are used for S and A arguments, while the accusative pronouns me, us, him, her, and them are used for O arguments. Perhaps a clearer example of a nominative accusative language is Latin. To borrow an example from Dixon, Dominus venit, the master comes. Dominus servum audit, the master hears the slave. Servus venit, the slave comes. Note how the nominative case, here with the suffix us, is used for the S argument of venit and the A argument of audit, while the accusative case, with the suffix is used only for the O argument of audit.
Alternatively, S can be merged with O instead of A. The resulting alignment is called ergative-absolutive. As with nominative-accusative alignment, there are two different ways of marking arguments, but in ergative-absolutive languages one is used for A and the other is used for S and O. A noun case which covers only A is called ergative, while the noun case which marks S and O is called absolutive. An example of an ergative language is the Australian language Diable, with examples from Dixon again. Ngoma banaganyu, father returned. Ngoma yamungoboran, mother saw father. Yabu banaganyu, mother returned. Note how the ergative case is used only for the A argument of bura, to see, while the absolutive case is used for the S argument of banaga, to return, and the O argument of bura, to see. Side note: Diable also has noun markers, which agree with each noun in case and noun class, as well as indicating deixis. Dixon notes that in all the Diable examples he gives, he has omitted the noun markers for clarity. A further example of an ergative phenomenon can be found in English, where some ambitransitive verbs like break equate S with O rather than with A. I break the window, but the window breaks. This phenomenon is common even in otherwise fully nominative accusative languages, and these verbs are sometimes called unaccusative verbs. A third and common possibility for alignment is split ergativity. In split ergative alignments, S is sometimes merged with A and sometimes with O. The language is split between nominative accusative and ergative absolutive alignments. This is often done on a fundamentally semantic basis. When S is more agentive, S takes the marking A has, but when S is less agentive, S takes the marking O has. Recall the earlier discussion about how the A argument is prototypically agentive, meaning in control of the action. Sometimes this also occurs due to tense or aspect differences. Split ergativity is very common, much more so than pure ergativity. In fact, almost all the so-called ergative languages are actually split ergative. For instance, Diable, mentioned a little bit earlier, is in fact split ergative rather than purely ergative. Pronouns use a nominative-accusative alignment, but other nouns use an ergative-absolutive alignment. Split ergativity is a topic in of itself, and will be covered later in its own section. It may be helpful to see a diagram of the various alignments together. This shows how nominative-accusative alignment equates S and A, ergative-absolutive alignment equates S and O, split ergativity equates S sometimes with A and sometimes with O, and tripartite all separate. I would be remiss if I didn't quickly cover the other possible alignments, as well as some of the other common ones. Direct alignment makes no distinctions whatsoever between S, A, and O. This alignment is understandably very rare, but it does occur as part of some of the more complex split ergative systems. Transitive alignment equates A and O while keeping S separate. You could say that it combines the worst parts of tripartite and direct alignment by redundantly marking S separately while not distinguishing between A and O. Transitive alignment is found only in the Iranian language Rushani, and is a product of the fact that Rushani is in the middle of a transition from ergative-absolutive to nominative-accusative alignment. This will be covered later. Austronesian or Philippine type alignment is a type of alignment found in many Austronesian languages, in which every verb takes a trigger affix. This affix determines the case marking of the verb's arguments and the focus of those arguments. Direct inverse alignment uses an animacy hierarchy to infer the roles in which the arguments of a verb are. If the arguments take opposite roles to those expected, a special inverse marker is added to the verb. This alignment will be discussed later in the section on split ergativity, along with the animacy hierarchy itself. And lastly, we have semantically based marking, in which each noun is marked for its semantic role rather than S, A, or O status, and I think could be considered a type of alignment. What is ergativity? So now we have established what ergative-absolutive alignment is. It's a method of marking arguments, in which S and O are grouped together and A is marked separately. Now, if that were all there is to the concept of ergativity, there wouldn't be much need for a video like this. However, it turns out there are very many ergative phenomena which equate S with O and keep A separate. There is ergative case marking, as mentioned previously, ergative verbal agreement, in which one set of affixes is used for S and O arguments, and another is used for A arguments. Ergative word order, where S and O have the same location in a sentence, but A does not. The many varieties of split ergativity, where the split between ergative absolutive and nominative accusative depends variously on the volitionality of the verb, the nature of the individual arguments, the tense or aspect of the clause, whether it's in a main or subordinate clause, or a combination of these. Syntactic ergativity, in which syntactic operations such as coordination and relativization treat S and O the same and A differently, and the anti-passive, a voice which is the opposite, quote-unquote, of passive and is often found in ergative languages. Now, one might reasonably wonder whether it is even sensible to lump all these disparate phenomena together, based only on the fact that they treat S and O together and differently from A. This is the position taken by Scott Delancey in his article The Blue Bird of Ergativity, in which he argues that these phenomena, while interesting on their own merits, do not deserve to be combined into a single typological category of ergativity. Such a classification, he argues, would be as useless as a group consisting of all blue birds. I would disagree with this. Many of the phenomena above co-occur with each other with a frequency which would be unusual if they were separate phenomena. For instance, all languages with syntactic ergativity also show either ergative case marking or ergative verbal agreement. Additionally, I aim to show that many of the phenomena mentioned share a common semantic basis. On the other hand, it is worth noting that the ergativity of a language has little to no effect on any aspect of the language outside what I've listed. Dixon reports that ergativity has little correlation, if any, to whether a language has verbal voice, a distinct class of adjectives, or a large number of ambitransitive/labile verbs. The only correlation he can find is that ergativity may be slightly more common in dependent marking languages. Side note. The mention of ambitransitive verbs is worth elaborating on. Some ambitransitive verbs have S equate with A, for instance, I go there, and I go. Others have S equate with O, for instance, I break it, and it breaks. Despite the fact that the former verb appears to be accusative, whereas the latter appears ergative, the number and type of ambitransitive verbs has no relation to whether a language is mainly accusative or ergative. For instance, Latin is accusative, whereas diabul is ergative, but both have nearly a complete lack of ambitransitive verbs. Fijian is not ergative, but almost all verbs in Fijian are ambitransitive, and there is a nearly equal split between S equating A and S equating O ambitransitive verbs, with only a slight bias of 3% towards S equating A. The distribution of ergativity. Although not particularly relevant for conlanging, it can sometimes be useful to know where in the world ergative languages occur. In Europe, almost all languages are nominative accusative. The only exceptions are Basque in Western Europe and the three Caucasian families, Northwest Caucasian, Northeastern Caucasian, and South Caucasian. Africa is remarkably devoid of ergative languages, but ergativity has been found in several Western Nilotic languages spoken in southern Sudan, most notably Pari. In Asia, many Tibeto-Burman languages are ergative, and so are many Indic and Iranian languages. So is the language isolate Burushaski. Another cluster of ergative languages can be found in the ancient Middle East: Sumerian, Hurrian, Urartian, Hattic, Elamite, and the Anatolian languages all show ergative characteristics. Some Siberian families, namely Chukotko-Kamchatkan and Yukagir, are also ergative. Many Austronesian languages show some ergativity, particularly the Polynesian languages Tongan and Samoan. In Maori, the passive voice is apparently used so often that it can appear ergative in some ways, although at the moment it is still very much a nominative-accusative language. Apparently, the Tamanic subgroup on Borneo and the South Sulawesi subgroup also display some ergativity. Many Philippine and Formosan languages, while not ergative, show that unusual Austronesian morphosyntactic alignment mentioned before. The greatest concentration of ergative languages is probably in Australia. The great majority of Australian languages show some ergative characteristics, and many have highly ergative grammars. Of particular note is the Diabol language, spoken southwest of Cairns in northeastern Queensland. We will be seeing a lot more of Diabol later, as it is pretty much a perfect example of a highly ergative language. Several Papuan languages, including Enga, Hua, Yimas, Yawa, Koyari, Kaluli, Kuara, and Kanun, show superficial ergative features. North America has few highly ergative languages, the main exception being the Eskimo-Aliot family. Tsimshian also has been reported to be ergative. Nez Perce is not ergative, but has that unusual tripartite alignment mentioned earlier. Its sibling language Sahaptin has a slightly more complex system. Many North American languages have a form of split ergativity known as active-stative alignment, the usual examples being Lakota and Eastern Pomo. In Central America, many Mayan languages are highly ergative, and the Mixe-Zoque family also shows ergativity. Many South American language families, including Jay, Arawak, Tupi-Guarani, Panoan, Takanan, Chibchan, Maku, and Carib, show complex split ergative systems. The isolates Trumai and Jabuti also show ergative features. One interesting thing to note about this list is that ergativity is more often an areal feature than a genetic one. For instance, one large cluster of ergative languages exists around the Himalayas, comprising Tibeto-Burman languages, some languages in the Iranic and Indic subgroups of Indo-European, and the isolate Burushaski. Another obvious one is in the Caucasus, comprising the three Caucasian families. Well, that's the end of Part 0, the introduction, which I hope was informative, albeit cursory. Next, we'll be looking at morphological ergativity with regards to case marking, agreement, and word order. Until then, thanks for watching, and as always, don't like and don't subscribe.